Boy, it's been a long time coming, but we've finally reached the end of 1988. We've got the last few days of December in terms of Japanese releases, as well as a handful of US releases from Konami, Sunsoft, and Tengen. This episode features mostly junk, but brace yourself for one fantastic game from Capcom. We begin on December 20th. Oh my god, the first game today, and already it begins. More goddamn baseball games. There are so many damn baseball games on the system that the genre is becoming ripe for parody. In fact, later on this episode, we'll actually see such a parody. For the moment, please observe that this is Pro Yakyuu Family Stadium 88, the third game in Namco's Famicom baseball series, which is very much beloved in Japan. As always, you pick the team based on real-life Japanese baseball teams. You then choose your lineup. One new option, pick a stadium. You can choose between 4 different venues for the game. Beyond that, it's business as usual. In fact, I dare you to pick out Family Stadium 88 out of a lineup of all the other Family Stadium games. One rather annoying trait of the series is that you always seem to hit foul balls. Just one after the other. Foul, foul, foul ball. Oh, this cut seems new. Pitching is, as usual, a bit easier than hitting. You choose between fast and slow balls. Slow balls often seem to confuse the CPU. A number of online sources state this was released in the US by Tengen as RBI Baseball 3, but that's not really the case. The first RBI Baseball game was a conversion of the first Family Stadium game, but RBI Baseball 2 and 3 are Western developed games that are actually unrelated to Family Stadium 87 and 88. Oh, and one last thing, fielding is still quite a bit of a pain. It's still hard to tell where the ball is going to land, and the CPU is good at smacking just sort of huge hits that land right out in the middle of your outfield. So obviously I'm getting pretty tired of these, but on the bright side, I think this is the last Pro Yakyuu Family Stadium game for the Famicom. Hey, a new HAL game! Last time we saw a game published by them was a couple of Eggerland games back in August of 1988. And this one is Rollerball. It was released in both Japan and the US, but both versions are just about identical. Now, don't get too excited by the name Rollerball. If you're thinking this is going to be based on the movie with James Caan and they'll be skating around killing people, then you'll be disappointed. Because Rollerball is a pinball game, and a pretty basic one at that. It does have a pretty tall table, 4 screens, based around a rather non-realistic view of Manhattan from the New York Harbor. You can see the Statue of Liberty and then the Empire State Building rising up behind it. Each new ball ends up on this screen. There's a few things to do here, a little slot machine, various kinds of bonuses. With a bit of luck, you can shoot up past the slot machine into the highest screen. You'll see a blimp flying around up there. I assume there was some sort of hidden screen access by opening the gate, but I didn't find it. As far as pinball games go, this one seems okay. It's nothing too exciting or special as far as I can tell. It's actually a reworked version of a 1984 computer game. You can note Satoru Iwata's name in the producer credit. I guess this must be a reference to the Yes song? Anyway, HAL made quite a few improvements to the original and released this Famicom version. There's even a 2-player competitive game built in. So, while Rollerball isn't so bad, it just seems a little bit ordinary. If you watch Chrontendo Episode 2, and really, you should if you haven't, then you've already seen Compile's completely awesome game Alien Crush. After that game, it's kinda hard to go back to stuff like this. December 21st. We're in the home stretch here, folks. From Kemco, this is Ginga Eiyuu Densetsu. Literally, Galaxy Hero Legend. Huh, you know those rubber nutsacks that people put on the bumper of their trucks? Looks like they attached one of those to an Imperial Star Destroyer. Tasteful. Oh wait, so the real title is Heldensagen vom Kosmosinsel? Or Hero Saga of Cosmic Island? And in English, the animated series is called Legend of Galactic Heroes. I guess it all amounts to about the same thing. So this is like a tactical space simulation game, which actually fits nicely in with the German name, since in Japan, they like to give German themes to military strategy type games. There's a pretty big cast of characters in this game. So you play as this commander of the Galactic Empire. I believe his name is Reinhard von Lohengram. He controls a big fleet of flying space phalluses that you can see in the background there. And oh man, that music! It's Ravel's Bolero, and it plays constantly throughout the entire game. Now I bet you're thinking, this was probably based on a cartoon, which it was, but originally it was a series of sci-fi novels. Then it became a manga and anime. It's one of those dramatic space opera epics about two rival empires locked in galactic war and blah blah blah. The game seems to capture the look of the cartoon, with lots of guys standing around on spaceships looking all intense. Quite frankly, it looks pretty boring, lots of yakety-yak going on. And there are eventually some space battles, but I think the first chunk of the game is just moving around space talking to people. You have a galaxy map, and you can travel from planet to planet or send out scout ships. Sounds a lot like Mass Effect now that I think about it. Now there are actually a bunch of games called Ginga Eiyuu Densetsu. There were several PC games, and there was also a Super Famicom game, which looks maybe a bit more exciting. Certainly the music is less irritating. And then later there was a Saturn game which had fully animated cutscenes and also much better music. And there have been newer games since then, but they all seem to be sort of space fleet simulation games. Anyway, the Famicom game seems pretty slow and repetitive. Maybe it would appeal to fans of the series, someone who would recognize characters and events from the TV show and be like, oh boy, here's the scene where Count von Wolfenvicker meets Baron Gliedgegessen, and ask him who his coiffeur is. But for everybody else, I suspect this game will be really dull. Here's another game from the none too prolific Bulletproof Software, Hank Rogers Company. If you ever get into your head to get a gun and test out the name Bulletproof Software, don't bother. I'm 99% sure their cartridges are not really bulletproof. Oh, the title screen explains where the Tetris blocks come from. They're pieces of masonry falling off St. Basil's Cathedral. At last, we know. And this is a cliché, but Tetris is a game which needs no introduction. This is, however, the first console version of Tetris. It had already been released commercially in the West on computers and arcades. You can select both stages and rounds here. If you choose a round other than 0, there will already be blocks in the bottom of the screen. And as you also probably noticed, you have a few different music choices. The rules are standard Tetris. You try to fill up an entire row with blocks, and then the row will disappear. You have to eliminate a set number of rows to move on. This is indicated with the lines counter up on the right side of the screen. When it reaches 0, you get your points added up, which takes an irritatingly long time. I guess it's intended to give you a little break between levels. Now, there's nothing really wrong with Bulletproof Software's version of Tetris, but it's probably not going to be your favorite version of Tetris either. I will point out this is not the same game released by Nintendo in the US. However, the well-known Game Boy version was also designed by Bulletproof. I think probably the main hang-up you'll encounter is that the controls are different than in most versions. You press down on the D-pad to rotate the blocks, and use the button to instantly drop down the blocks. Later versions, like the Game Boy Tetris, reverse this, so you'll sort of have to kind of retrain your reflexes while you're playing. It's also pretty slow compared to most other versions, and it's single player only. And of course there is a huge and dramatic story behind Tetris and the rights to the game that involves Hank Rogers, Nintendo, Tengen, the Soviet authorities, and others. Chrontendo will go into that story in detail once we reach the Tengen release of Tetris. We have exactly one FDS game today. Oh lord, why that horrible high-pitched noise? Then a second later we get this dreary, almost punitive-sounding musical theme. This is Taro, sometimes called Taro Uranai, from Scorpionsoft, one of the least prolific video game publishers we'll encounter. In fact, this is their second and last game for the Famicom. The other was Michael English Daiboken from 1987, in which a cartoon cat teaches you English. Taro Uranai is yet another fortune-telling game. We've seen these before in Chrontendo 38 and 39. I guess they were briefly popular in late 1988. This one is based around the tarot deck. You have 3 different categories which you can look into: love, business, and study. Then you choose the pattern that the cards are set down into: a heart, V-shape, or a cross. You then get this pointless but sort of fun part where you scatter the cards. One button moves the cards around randomly, as if you were pushing them around on the table, and the other collects them back into a pile. This is probably the neatest part of the game. You then get to choose which cards you want to use, and they're placed on the heart shape or whatever shape you chose. You will then get to reveal the cards. Each time a card is flipped over, there is a long loading pause. You then see the card and you get an explanation as to what it means. Since the game is so boring, I thought I'd explain what exactly tarot is. It's an old card game, probably Italian in origin. The tarot deck is related to our standard 52 card deck, except that it has different face cards. Italian tarot decks normally have suits of wands, swords, cups, and coins, whereas French tarot used clubs, spades, diamonds, and hearts. The face cards are based on sort of standard archetypes: the king, the pope, the fool, the mountebank, or as well as natural or biblical concepts such as the sun, moon, judgment day, or the Tower of Babel. The game of tarot and its variations are still commonly played in Europe, but a new use emerged in the 1800s when a mystic named Eliphas Levi popularized the concept of the tarot deck as having occult meanings. Tarot as a form of divination became well known in the UK and the US in the early 20th century with the publication of the Rider-Waite Tarot deck, which gave the tarot deck a more occulty sort of makeover, changing the Pope card to the Hierophant, for example. Most modern tarot decks, and the cards here, are sort of inspired by the imagery of the Rider-Waite deck. As a result, in the US, we commonly think of tarot as a fortune-telling device rather than a card game. Apparently the same is true in Japan. So that's 3 fortune-telling games in December '88. If nothing else, it proves that Rare's Taboo, The Sixth Sense, has some sort of tradition behind it. Here we have the first of 2 Tosa developed games today. I know, 2 Tosa games. How lucky can you get? It's the latest in Jellicoe's Moero Sports Series, Moero Pro Soccer. Do all the Moero games show a ball bouncing off the exclamation points in the logo with such force that it actually deforms the ball? As far as I know, yes, they all do. I wonder if those are real soccer league emblems. You wouldn't think that the US would need yet another soccer game, but this was released in the US as Goal. It's funny, quite a few of the Moero games got US releases. There was Bases Loaded, Hoops, this game. The one that didn't get a US release was Moero Judo. You have the typical gameplay options, then you choose a country. I'm pretty sure all the countries are exactly the same. There don't appear to be any individual stats. There aren't even individual players, just a bunch of identical guys in uniforms. Some soccer games orient the fields vertically, others left to right. Moero Pro Soccer does it around a 45-degree angle. Now take a look at your players there. The fellow with a little 1 below him is the guy that you're currently controlling. He controls much like the other soccer games we've seen. You automatically dribble the ball while moving around. One button kicks, the other passes. You need to use the D-pad to sort of point the direction while you're passing. It doesn't automatically kick towards one of your teammates, so you can get some wild passes if you're not careful. When you make a goal, this guy gets really excited and runs around screaming. And I guess the crowd is going wild. Of course, some of the typical issues occur. When you're not in possession of the ball, the game will automatically switch control to the teammate nearest the ball, or at least it's supposed to. It does seem to sort of switch around haphazardly at times, and this can cause frustration when you're running around trying to get control from the other team. Compared to some other soccer games, the camera is zoomed out quite a bit, giving you a pretty good view of the field. Still, there will definitely be times when none of your players are visible on screen and you're wondering where they are. The game is really nothing special visually. Some of the graphics and the cutscenes are pretty ugly. The sound effects are a bit annoying, but you know, I've played worse soccer games, so really, Moero Pro Soccer isn't really half bad. Alright, we've got a few more US games from December 1988, starting with Skate or Die, the curious collaboration between Electronic Arts and Konami. This was the first EA title to reach the NES, I believe. Look at this rad skater, such attitude. If nothing else, Skate or Die has pretty good music. So rather than your typical boring menu page, you begin in the skate shop, owned by Rodney Recluse, who was apparently intended to resemble a punk rock Rodney Dangerfield. If you're too young to remember who Rodney Dangerfield is, don't worry about it. He was an old school comedian who had a strange career revival in the 1980s. As you move around the cursor, which you'll see is shaped like the words Skate or Die, Rodney will say various amusing or informative things. My favorite little bit here is that he appears to be an ex-Marine. Now before you can compete, you need to sign in. This makes sense. But after typing in your name, you have to save and exit. Well, to do this, you hit Cancel. Yes, Cancel replaces what would normally be called Done, Save, OK, or Accept in other video games. That's right, Cancel. That makes absolutely no sense. Out on the street, you need to skate around and then choose the event that you want. Skate or Die was originally an EA computer game from 1987. Here's the Commodore 64 version, which had even more rockin' music. The game was quite successful, which somehow led to the deal with Konami to port it to the NES, under their Ultra label. One thing missing from the NES game is that you could choose your own skateboard color in the computer game. So Skate or Die was pretty much EA's entry into the world of console gaming, for better or worse. As we can see, the NES version looks almost identical to the original. So all told, there are 5 events: Joust, Race, Jam, High Jump, and Freestyle. Freestyle, or Ramp, is like a more exciting version of the figure skating from Winter Games. You skate by repeatedly pressing the A button to build up speed. When you reach the top of the ramp, you do some D-pad and button moves to perform a trick. Then you go down and just keep going, performing tricks to try to rack up a high score. Now I didn't quite get the hang of it, and kept falling down, so yeah, I'm definitely having Winter Games flashbacks here. Now so far so good. Some graphics are reused in the next event, the High Jump. So here's where we start coming into some problems. Just like Freestyle, you begin by pressing the A button. But do you build up speed by rapidly pressing the A button? Nope, you build up speed by rapidly pressing the B button. So we have 2 similar events with similar controls, except for some reason a function has been switched from the A button to the B button. What's also weird is that you have to hit the A button while in the air in order to lock in your attempt. If you don't, the game won't count the best attempt as your final score, but rather it'll count the last attempt instead. Jam and Race are 2 events that use a dual control scheme, Regular Foot and Goofy Foot. Goofy Foot is actually where you put your right foot at the front of the board, though the sprite here is actually the same regardless of which one you choose. In Regular, the control pad theoretically causes your skater to go in the same direction that you press on the D-pad. However, it does do some kind of strange stuff, like let's say the skater is pointing to the right, and you want to turn him 90 degrees clockwise. Do you press down? Nope. Maybe left? Nope, you press right. Now with Goofy Foot, the controls are somewhat inverted. The directional buttons are used relative to the direction that your skater is facing. So if you are facing down, you press left to turn right, and vice versa. And as in our example above, if you are facing right and you want to turn 90 degrees clockwise, you press right, which is the same as regular foot, which doesn't make any sense. Also, to speed up in Goofy Foot, you press up on the D-pad and down to slow down. In regular, this is reversed. But then you also have these crazy controls for hitting or kicking. You press the A button while pressing the D-pad in the direction you are facing, and that will hit. To kick, you press A while pressing the D-pad in the opposite direction that you're facing. To jump, you press A while holding up, and to duck, you press A while holding down. I think that these controls are the same for Goofy and regular Foot, but by now I'm so confused I can't remember. So who was the guy who designed this level, and why was he not aware that the NES had 2 buttons? Why map punch, kick, jump, and duck all to the same button? The B button is not used at all. And in Race, if you fall down, you need to hit the A button to get back up. But in Jam, this happens automatically. Why? Sure, all this sounds like fun, but damn guys, why did you have to make the controls so unintuitive? And why does your character change appearance in every single event? In Jam, you have this crazy spiked hair, and then in the downhill race, you have like regular short hair. Alright, so the last event is the pool event, Joust. Once again, your character sprite is totally different. The object is to just hit the other guy with your American Gladiator style oar. It's pretty straightforward, though control of the oar automatically switches between each person every 5 seconds. Now I'm not saying that Skate or Die isn't or cannot be a fun game. The main appeal is probably the 2-player mode, and then it's more often just used for screwing around and trying to knock each other down. But the game would be much better if the controls were implemented better, or at least in a way that makes sense. Now Skate or Die is clearly inspired by the Atari arcade game, 720 Degrees. In fact, the phrase Skate or Die is taken directly out of that game. 720 Degrees had a 360 degree joystick setup that worked much better than the D-pad. In fact, to me, Skate or Die seems sort of like an unnecessary hybrid between 720 Degrees and the epic sports games, and really is one of the most frustrating games I've seen in a while. Next up, we have 2 US games from Sunsoft, starting with Platoon? Really? A game based on Platoon? I guess that sorta makes sense. Platoon was technically an action-y war movie, though really nothing like the kind of movies that normally get made into games, like Rambo or Predator. How many other movies won the Oscar for Best Picture and got a video game adaptation, I wonder? The Godfather, I guess, and Lord of the Rings has also been made into video games. Anyway, Platoon was the 1986 movie that catapulted Oliver Stone to fame, inspired by his own experiences in Vietnam. If any of you younger folk out there only know Charlie Sheen as a washed-up porn star banging cokehead walking punchline, then be aware that he was briefly considered to have a lot of promise as a young actor in Platoon, Wall Street, before moving on to worse and worse movies. In Platoon, you play as the Sheen character, Chris Taylor, at least in theory. Whoa, what just happened there? And again? What? How is that fair? Well, kids, I guess Platoon is not fair. So, the game slightly resembles some scenes from Platoon the movie, sort of. It's divided into 4 levels, each completely different than all the others. In the first, you're trying to find some explosives in a jungle and blow up a bridge. The problem is the explosives and bridge are somewhere in a huge maze-like jungle that gives you no clues as to where they are, and every screen looks exactly the same. So you just wander around and around and around and hope that you somehow stumble onto the explosives. If the layout of Rambo drove you crazy, then prepare to be driven absolutely nuts by Platoon. Viet Cong are constantly walking around and randomly shooting you, frequently jumping out and actually landing on you. The game seems to love knocking you down, and just as you're getting up from the ground, having another guy jump and land on you. And you see those almost invisible brown tripwires along the ground? Setting one of those off will cost you 1 life, so move very carefully and constantly check the ground for tripwires. Now if this seems terrible, you should check the computer versions. Oh lord, is this really the music? Platoon started off as a computer game from Ocean Software, a British developer who were mostly known for cranking out crappy licensed games in the 80s. They ended up being absorbed by Infogrames and eventually Atari UK. This is the terrible DOS version. Naturally, it got rave reviews from the gaming press when it came out. Now, I assume that almost anyone trying to play Platoon nowadays would probably give up before finding the bridge. But if you do somehow manage to find it, you'll blow it up, which knocks you down but doesn't cause any damage. You next need to find the entrance to the next level. The game doesn't tell you this, of course, maybe the manual does. The game is sort of like in the vein of Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom or Skate and Die. Nothing is really explained in the game, you have to read the manual to figure out what to do. Naturally, the huts are booby-trapped, which of course will cost you 1 life if you happen to accidentally come across a booby trap. You then need to find a map, a torch, so much for localization, and of course the entrance to the tunnels. The game warns you against shooting villagers, but it doesn't really matter. My lord, why is that text so fast? Now if you're hoping the game gets better at this point, then you are totally naive, I'm afraid. The second level is the tunnel system and is really annoying. The developers for some reason could only conceive of a sewer system for a tunnel level, so you are knee-deep in water, despite the fact that a village in the jungle consisting of 8 huts with no visible plumbing would not have a gigantic underground sewer system straight out of The Third Man. As you walk, your crosshairs swing from side to side. I'm not doing that, it actually happens automatically as you walk. But why? It makes it much harder to shoot the guys when they pop out of the water. Oh yeah, and see the ammo in the lower left corner? That's how many bullets you have. Good luck. Level 3 is short and boring. You simply move around the crosshairs and shoot the shadowy shapes that appear. It's really easy, and you actually have more than enough ammo. For some reason, the amount of ammo that you have and the way the lives work actually changes each level. In the first level you have 5 lives, and if you die you start off in the same place. In level 2 through 4 you have 2 lives, and you start low from the beginning if you happen to die. The fourth and final level is just a very repetitive series of screens where you shoot soldiers that run out across the top of the screen. There are bullets flying out from the bushes at the bottom, but if you position yourself at the very bottom of the screen, those bullets will pass right through you. Also, if you get to the top of the screen, the soldiers cannot hurt you. Did I mention that this game makes no goddamn sense? And to make matters weirder, the game ends with the final boss being Tom Berenger's character, Sergeant Barnes, at least according to the NES manual. While the film does end with Taylor killing Barnes, it doesn't somehow seem right that a Nintendo game is sort of instructing kids to frag their superior officers. If you beat the game, you are rewarded with this cutscene featuring the only known 8-bit rendition of Charlie Sheen in existence. Oh, and if you're wondering about other video game renditions of Tom Berenger, well, Gray Fox in Metal Gear 2 was based on him. The bottom line is, Platoon is alternately too hard, too easy. It's also frustrating, pointless, repetitive, unfair. In fact, it commits just about every video game sin imaginable. In other words, it sucks big time. So, if you thought Platoon was just too compelling and exciting, then I have a game for you. Xenophobe, our second US Sunsoft game. See the chick holding the laser rifle? She does not appear anywhere in this game, at all. And hear the music? I hope you get your fill of that tune because you're not going to hear any more music from this game for quite some time. Okay, so a giant spaceship sends you to a tiny little planet. And there you are. Man, you are wearing some hipster pants. Damn. So you shoot aliens with your little gun thing. Each one takes a bunch of hits to kill. You can eventually find better weapons. Sometimes aliens will drop things. Oh look, a gasoline can. Do they really use gasoline in space? I mean, I assume everything would be powered by fusion generators or something futuristic like that. Xenophobe first appeared as a Bally Midway arcade game in 1987, notable for the fact that 3 people could play it at once, each with their own horizontal sliver of screen. Also, it's known as the game where space crabs attach themselves to your crotch. Sunsoft's NES port drops the number of players from 3 to 2, which makes sense due to the NES's lower resolution. Even so, decent chunks of the screen are taken up by useless gray bars. Each level is made up of a handful of rooms connected by automatic doors at each end. The whole series of rooms loops around in an endless circle, so you can never really go anywhere. Later levels have multiple floors connected by elevators, but really there's not much to see or do in any of the rooms. They're all the same, basically. Likewise, aliens drop various objects, but other than the occasional weapon or health refill, the items don't really seem to do anything. They're for points only. So after wandering around shooting aliens for 5 minutes, the screen will start flashing and you'll be teleported back to your ship. The game notes the number of aliens that you killed, as well as the items that you picked up. Or valuable hardware, as the game calls it. You then get points and then you're on to level 2. Which leads me to explain Xenophobe's big problem. There's no point whatsoever in the game. You play it just by staying on a level for 5 minutes. There's no object or goal whatsoever beyond getting points and not dying. There are no bosses, no special rooms to reach, no hostages to save, no objective. You can technically win the game without ever killing a single alien or collecting an item or actually doing anything. The arcade game was a bit more fun. There were a lot of aliens on the screen at all times, you could get easily overwhelmed, and the 3-player co-op made sense, as you blasted your way through tons of aliens. Here there are only around 2 enemies on the screen at once. If you kill one, another will materialize at some random place on screen. It's not really that hard to avoid them, so to compensate for the lack of masses of aliens, each one not only takes 1 hit but many hits to kill. Even the 2-player version is sort of messed up. You can't play as different characters, the game will always use the same character for both players. But why? Really, Xenophobe is sort of amazing. I can't recall the last time I saw a game this pointless. You just walk through a bunch of identical rooms shooting aliens for no reason. Add in the crummy graphics, the almost total lack of music, and you've got a staggeringly unenjoyable game. Okay, we've got 2 games from Tengen here with unknown release dates. This will close out the US releases for 1988. I actually sort of like the theme music here. Alright, so there are 3 zones, or difficulty levels, as you or I would call them. Why does Tengen give everything weird names? It's like referring to the stages in Indiana Jones as waves. You start by spending your stars on your stats. Shot range is always a good idea. You can also stock up on fuel, shields, or bombs. So Vindicators is vaguely RPG-ish. If this were a Japanese game, I'd call it a vertical run-and-gun. You control a tank. You need to shoot enemy tanks and turrets. Don't touch those red things. You can't tell by looking at them, but they're some sort of landmine. But the little green men are good. The game calls them stars for some reason. They're basically the game's currency. Vindicators first saw the light of day as an arcade game from early in 1988. We just saw it in the 1988 arcade roundup a few episodes ago. The technical highlight of the game was the digitized graphics used in things like explosions. Atari Games was sort of heading down a path that will lead to the likes of Pit Fighter a few years from now. Not necessarily a good idea. It's also notable for its dual joystick tank controls and the fact that it's very easy to run out of fuel very quickly and get a game over. The NES version has obviously considerably downgraded the graphics, but it's otherwise very similar to the original. The object is to make it from the bottom of the level to the top, all the while picking up stars as well as shields, bombs, and most importantly fuel. You see, your fuel is constantly depleting. Run out of fuel and you will die. Just as important as fuel are keys. Sometimes they're just lying around, other times you need to kill an enemy to get one. But without the keys, the doors at the end of each level will not open. So after completing a level, you'll want to spend the stars that you collected, maybe on some upgrades, maybe get some more fuel. Definitely don't want to start a level with not enough fuel. And why is the game's currency in the form of stars anyway? I guess that's something only Atari knows. Vindicators is a bit slower and more methodical than similar games such as Jackal. The reliance on fuel is a bit of a pain. Sometimes you just don't find much fuel. It makes dying a bit arbitrary. Oh, I've run out of fuel capsules this level. I guess I'll die in a few seconds. Looking for fuel, no, nothing here, no, oh well. Bombs are sometimes necessary to blow open doors, though this little bonus level tempts you with many items, all the while counting down until the room explodes and you die. What a horrible little trick. All in all, Vindicators is better than some of the other Tengen games we've been seeing recently. Certainly it's more fun than Paperboy, and it's not the major screw-up that Indiana Jones was. The tank controls are a little weird, bosses are a major pain, and it's pretty repetitive, not to mention that like almost every other US-only release, it was a game that was also released for virtually every other platform in existence, so it's nothing new or special. It even came out for the damn ZX Spectrum. So, Tengen's Vindicators is nothing very exciting. One more Tengen game, Super Sprint. Like most Tengen games, it's not quite clear when this was really released. Some sources think 1988, some say 1989. It's copyrighted 1989, but my notes say late 1988, so here it is. If anyone out there listening has a sense of personal identity built around the idea of Super Sprint being released in 1989, then you have my apologies for offending you. I'm sure I don't need to explain this, but Super Sprint is a racing game of the top-down variety. It's got little teeny tiny toy-like cars. We've seen several top-down racing games on the Famicom, like Nintendo's Grand Prix, and of course there was Rare's RC Pro-Am. But this one is old school, no fancy scrolling or anything like that. Nope, it's a single-screen deal all the way. It almost seems deliberately retro. Super Sprint actually has a bit of history behind it. It was first released in arcades in 1986. The arcade game had high-resolution graphics and a few nice touches like the helicopter that flies down whenever you crash. If this does seem a little archaic compared to other contemporary arcade games like Outrun or something like that, the reason is actually a graphically updated version of an old Atari game called Sprint from 1978. Which is actually an update of a 1974 Atari arcade game called Grand Track 10, which was the first arcade game to use ROM in the hardware. So here's the thing, I've disliked some racing type games due to them having very digital type controls, where the vehicle can only face in like 8 distinct directions or so. The cycling section of the last episode's Triathlon was a good example of this. Super Sprint has super finely adjusted controls. Your car can turn very smoothly, but it feels like the track is covered in Vaseline or something. You slip and slide all over the place. If you're moving very fast at all, your car will just turn around and plow right into a wall. The physics are completely unrealistic. The cars feel super light. They have no weight whatsoever. It feels more like you're racing Matchbox cars than real vehicles. Picking up wrenches in the road will allow you to upgrade between races. Super traction seems like your best bet. Speed and acceleration is just begging for trouble. An increased score? You can actually buy a higher score? That's weird. And here's the screen when you win a race. What are those green things? The artist went through all the trouble of like adding in those 3 green blocks, but why? What are they supposed to represent? A lot of the decisions made in Tengen games seem sort of inexplicable. Like, why was the helicopter eliminated? You still crash, but there's no helicopter. They didn't have enough spare room on the cart to add a helicopter? I mean, this is actually a pretty small game as it is. It's not like it was like, stretching the limits of cart technology at the time. Just like Paperboy, it eventually got a Japanese release by Ultron. Much like Skate or Die, 2-player is definitely the way to go. At least it gives Super Sprint some entertainment value, otherwise it's not very entertaining. Oh no, the world just got blowed up. Just in time for Christmas Eve, 1988, it's Akira, published by Taito and developed by Tosa. Despite Toza's involvement, some of the art is pretty slick looking, though I think all the illustrations were pretty much copied directly from the images in the comic book or the movie, which must have helped since Toza was never known for having pretty artwork in its games. So Toza had a game out on both the 23rd and the 24th of December. They just keep pumping them out. This was released to tie in with the Akira animated movie, which was released earlier that year. A lot of people seem to really like that movie. In the mid to late 80s, there was a whole lot of interest in Japanese comics and anime, and the movie actually got pretty hyped for the US theatrical release in 88 or 89. I remember seeing it back in the theater then, and remember thinking it was kind of stupid and overrated, but what do I know? Anyway, as we can see here, the game's cutscenes very closely emulate the movie. The plot revolves around psychic mutant kids, naturally, as well as a secret military conspiracy and teenage biker gangs. I guess in the future, style will have evolved to the point where high-ranking army bigwigs sport mini mohawks, and violent street gangs wear normal bowl haircuts. By the way, Akira is sort of a pretty much standard Japanese adventure game, though one with probably even less interactivity than most. The commands are as expected: look, talk, interact, listen, and of course others appear when necessary. As far as I can recall, this recreates the events of the movie pretty closely, which is probably something of a liability. I think the point is simply to follow the storyline of the movie. There don't seem to be any puzzles of any sort, and there are long stretches of dialogue with no interactivity at all. The game looks pretty decent and has some wacky music at certain spots, but it seems sort of halfway between a typical Japanese adventure game and a visual novel. You can, however, die if you do something wrong. If you choose hit instead of duck here, when dealing with this guy, you will get knocked out, but the game gives you an option to restart one screen before the place where you got killed. A little bit later, I did something stupid and was arrested and ended up in jail. I'd say that Akira was definitely aimed at fans of the movie, rather than gaming fans. I guess it's not terrible, but it's hardly an engrossing game. Wow, at last! Ernest Borgnine in 8-bit form. Hey, did you guys know that Ernest Borgnine was still alive? I was surprised to find that out. Airwolf is published by Kyugo, a pretty damn obscure company who didn't produce very many other games, as far as I know. In Airwolf you control the titular helicopter. The control panel looks really confusing. Luckily this isn't a flight simulator, it's a horizontal shoot-'em-up. First thing to do is pick your weapons. You have a few options for the air-to-air weapon as well as the so-called surface weapon, which actually can be used to hit other flying enemies for some reason. The cannon's probably the best option. If you're not familiar with Airwolf, well, it was a television series from the mid-80s about a dude in a high-tech military helicopter. It was created by Don Belisario, who created all sorts of very popular TV shows back then: Magnum P.I., Quantum Leap, and nowadays NCIS. This Airwolf game is not the same game released in the US by Acclaim, which really was a bit of a flight simulation game, and is not considered to be very good. Now, as it turns out, this Airwolf game is not very hot either. It's a pretty basic shooter with a few issues. The background can be a bit busy and can camouflage the activity in the foreground at times. There is also quite a bit of slowdown when too many enemies and projectiles come on the screen at once. In fact, the constant slowing down and then speeding up again gets pretty irritating. Airwolf is in fact a port of a 1987 arcade game from Kyugo. The arcade game is just as obscure as the Famicom version, but definitely has a cleaner looking screen, and makes much better use of the surface weapons. There's actually lots of stuff on the ground you can blow up. Now at the end of each level you'll encounter a boss, but here's the weird thing. For the boss battles, the viewpoint switches to like a first-person view, and you control the white crosshair, which you use to shoot out the various guns and cannons on the battleship. You also need to shoot down the very slow-moving missiles that are headed towards you, I should point out that the control of the crosshair is very sluggish and has some sort of like momentum built into it, so it actually does take a second to like stop and change directions. This makes shooting the missiles much harder than it would be otherwise. Beyond that, there's really not a whole lot to say about Airwolf. There are no weapons, power-ups, or anything. You will occasionally see like these POW icons, but surprisingly, they only give you points instead of power-ups. I love the way that on this level, you get attacked by satellite dishes and radio antennas. The most interesting thing about the design of Airwolf is that enemies can come at you from all angles, front, behind. They will often pass over you and then loop around and attack you from below. That's a bit different than most shooters. Other than that, it's still pretty much a pretty generic shooter. It's not the worst we've seen, but pretty unimpressive compared to the stuff from Konami or Compile. You know, of all the things out there that could possibly be adapted into video games, I never thought I'd be seeing a game based on Little Lord Fauntleroy, but here it is. Shoukoushi Ceddie, or Little Prince Ceddie. This one character portrait's actually not bad, I suppose. Mostly though, the game is pretty damned ugly. It was published by Fuji Television, who, as you might recall, were the original publishers of Nintendo's Doki Doki Panic, aka Super Mario Bros. 2 in the US. As I mentioned, the original source material for this game was Francis Hodgson Burnett's 1896 children's novel, Little Lord Fauntleroy. It's about a kid from New York who turns out to be next in line for a British earldom. It's a classic fish-out-of-water story, with good old-fashioned American can-do meeting hidebound British traditionalism. It was made into countless movies, and in 1988 an animated version in Fuji's long-running World Masterpiece Theater TV series, which was produced by Nippon Animation, came out. The name Shoukoushi Ceddie was used for this version, Ceddie being Fauntleroy's actual nickname, short for Cedric. Sadly, while the cartoon was very nice looking, this game is not. I appear to be fenced in by invisible walls. You need to exit through the doors. An action menu appears, and at this point you might figure out that Shoukoushi Ceddie is an adventure game, though not quite a traditional one, especially since it has these top-down, quote-unquote action sequences. You move from area to area, and you will encounter various people and talk to them, much like any other Portopia-style game. The first part takes place in the Earl's castle, or so it seems. You can leave the castle, but due to some bad programming, I got instantly hit by another character the split second I enter the next screen. This causes this guy to appear, who chides you and asks you some questions that you have to answer. However, once I exited this screen and reappear on the main screen, I'm still touching the other character, causing this same guy to pop up again, ad infinitum. Okay, so I tried again and managed to get actually onto the regular overworld without bumping into someone. This is like the quasi-action sequence here. You need to jump over other people on the road. It's much easier said than done. The controls are quite terrible. When we finally reach the next location, it looks much like the castle. All the locations actually look kind of similar. Note that you can talk to animals, and one of your menu options is flute, which plays the flute. This actually is important later. And by the way, a dragon appears later in the game. None of this makes much sense to me. Ceddie was developed by a company called Graphic Research, another for-hire developer. I tried to find something interesting in their game credits, but other than a Speed Racer game for the PlayStation, they didn't produce anything anyone's ever heard of. Shoukoushi Ceddie ends up being a rather unusual adventure game. Speaking of which, check out our next game. Alright, we've got one last game to take a look at before we get on to this episode's big game. Capcom released 2 games on Christmas Eve, the first of which we'll examine is Pro Yakyuu Satsujin Jiken. Yep, after tons of Pro Yakyuu games and Satsujin Jiken games, Capcom combined the two into this game, a pro baseball themed murder mystery adventure game. So the story concerns a former pro baseball player who gets embroiled in a murder case, in which the killers were dressed as ball players. He ended up going on the lam and trying to track down the real killers. Rather than the first-person viewpoint found in so many Portopia-type games, Pro Yakyuu uses the top-down mode. Unlike a lot of these games, the game looks really good, with detailed graphics and sort of well-defined looking characters. What's sort of weird is that the protagonist appears to be based on a real ball player, Igawa Suguro. He had his own baseball game for the Mega Drive a few years down the road. So Capcom wasn't satisfied with making a typical Japanese adventure game, so they added in various additional elements. There are mini-games found throughout, and if you have a run-in with the police, you'll get into this silly sort of top-down vertical shooter sequence. As you may have noticed, you have hit points, as seen in the upper left corner. If this drops to 0, you die, but you'll be resurrected at a save point. The hit points, or LP for life points as the game calls them, gradually decrease just as you walk around. So Capcom went above and beyond the quality of most games like this, and they actually got pretty creative it seems. Despite a shaky start, Capcom is rapidly becoming one of the best publishers for the Famicom and NES, as demonstrated more clearly by our next game. Mega Man 2 begins with one of the greatest NES title sequences ever. It's so simple, no lengthy dialogues or cinematic cutscenes, yet it's memorable and highly effective. And there we go. Notice the two difficulties. Holy shit, there's a password system now? Thank you, Capcom. Mega Man 2 starts out exactly like Mega Man 1. You choose a Robot Master and head off to that level. We'll begin with the obliquely named Flashman. So the one thing that was added to the US version was the easy version, called Normal. For the sake of getting this video done in a timely fashion, we are going to go with Normal. Of course, even at the higher difficulty, Mega Man 2 is easier in the first game for a variety of reasons. It's also longer, so the password feature is actually a pretty good idea. Since we have no special weapons yet, we'll find various inaccessible areas. For example, that little wall there can be destroyed using the crash bombs. If we'd already defeated Crash Man, we'd be able to grab that. I think Flashman stage is sort of one of the traditional first stages for people playing Mega Man 2. It doesn't have anything wildly difficult in it. Oh, and as you may have seen, I got an energy tank. Unlike Mega Man 1, you can store energy tanks for later use. They serve as health refills. Just like the first Mega Man game, Mega Man 2 mixes up horizontal and vertical sections, lots of jumping, climbing ladders, falling down vertical shafts. Some levels feature elements that are almost puzzle-like, as we'll see later. At the end of each level, you'll enter a room and fight a Robot Master. Flashman has the power to stop time, but is mostly a wuss, and can be defeated with the standard Mega Blaster pretty easily. After defeating the Robot Master, you'll obtain his weapon, and in this case, you get one of the 3 special items from Dr. Light. They are equipped, just like the Robot Master's weapons, but are used more for transportation purposes, as we'll see later. Mega Man 2 very much retains the original's rock, paper, scissors philosophy. Certain weapons will be very effective against particular Robot Masters. Additionally, the special items that Dr. Light gives you make certain levels easier. Everyone has their own preferred order to clear the stages in. For some reason, I did Airman's level second, which many people prefer doing after Woodman so you can use the Leaf Shield. I'll assume that most people out there are familiar with this song, Airman ga Taosenai. It became a huge online hit a few years back. It's all about the extreme frustration that Airman brings. On regular difficulty, he's not that tough, assuming that you have enough health to withstand getting hit by the tornadoes a couple times. Capcom's first Mega Man game featured an exceptional amount of variety and creativity in the level design. It was very unusual for its time, late 1987, but Mega Man 2 completely outdoes its predecessor. Bubble Man's level takes you underwater, and you even get a giant mini-boss-like fish. And of course, Mega Man would not be complete without tons of spiky objects that will instantly kill you if you touch them. It's kind of weird that Mega Man can be pummeled by lasers, fire, run over by a giant tank, and so on, and survive, yet even slightly touching a sharp surface will cause him to explode. Quickman's level gets pretty nuts in places. Speed is the theme here, and giant lasers start shooting at you. Again, these are one-hit kills. You're running only like a fraction of a second ahead of these things, meaning you'll have to memorize the quickest path to take. And this will often require pressing the D-pad left or right as you exit a screen from the bottom so that you're facing the right direction when you land in the next screen. You'll probably lose a few lives the first time you encounter this level. This part is also cool. The level is pitch black and only occasionally lit by these enemies with the flaming heads. Quickman is a good example of a robot master weak to a particular weapon. Flashman's Time Stopper will shave off half his life bar, and then you can finish him off much easier. In the Mega Man fan community, there is much discussion as to which are the best robot masters from the series, based on, I suppose, their character design, the usefulness of their weapons, and how cool their names are. Metal Man is one of the favorites, and his metal blade is a pretty awesome piece of weaponry, deadly and uses up very little energy. The one thing that is interesting is the technology behind a robot that shoots metal blades or wind or bombs or something is quite believable. But what about Flashman? Dr. Wily invented a way of actually stopping time. Aside from being a major scientific discovery, that would be an incredible weapon. Why didn't he install a time-stopping device onto every single robot, or his own ship? I mean, Dr. Wily appears to be brilliant, but also sort of an idiot at the same time. Okay, so what other kind of cool things are in this game? Well, how about giant fire-breathing prototypes for Rush, who would actually debut in Mega Man 3? This level belongs to Woodman, and I guess it's kind of weird. It seems sort of animal-themed. I guess it's trickier to design a level based around a guy called Woodman than, say, Fireman. A Fireman level pretty much creates itself, pits of lava and so forth. And Woodman is not exactly everybody's favorite robot master. Why the hell would you build a robot with a wooden shell? And then he shoots leaves at you? Of course, he's actually a bit of a pain if you don't have the crash bombs, which I don't. That means he's completely invulnerable to your attacks while he has a leaf shield surrounding him. His weapon, however, does come in handy in spots, like Crashman's level. You can jump around trying to shoot these guys without falling off a little moving platform, or you can just turn on the leaf shield and chill. As for Crashman himself, he's almost comically susceptible to Airman's weapon. When you defeat him, you get the crash bombs, which are little timed detonation devices you can throw at things. They're used for, among other things, blowing up those brick walls you see. In terms of level difficulty, Fireman's level probably takes the top prize, at least if you're not equipped with the right weapons. Lots of jumping over fiery pits, and let's not forget the vanishing blocks. One of the hardest parts of Mega Man 1 makes an appearance here. Their first appearance in Fireman's level is just sort of a warm-up. But a bit later in the level, you'll find yet another series of disappearing blocks that actually carry you across a fire pit and then afterwards a bottomless pit. This would almost certainly eat up quite a few lives trying to figure out the block's patterns, unless you have the item number 2, in which case you can simply jump on it and sail right over the fire pit and just jump off at the end. Problem solved. Trust me, this is definitely the easiest way to get past this part of the game. Fireman is pretty easy if you have Bubble Man's weapon and if you figure out his attack pattern. Naturally, once you defeated all the robot masters, it's time to deal with Dr. Wily himself, who flies off to his castle, which is designed with a surprising number of phallic symbols built into it. Wily's castle requires you to make use of all your special items to get past certain roadblocks. This right here is one of the trickiest parts, actually. You need to lay down a series of flying platforms very quickly in order to reach the ladder without hitting the ceiling first. Once you somehow manage to do this, the very next screen has some flying enemies which will knock you down if you hesitate for even 1 second while climbing the ladder. At the end of this first part of Dr. Wily's castle, you will encounter the first large boss, a fire-breathing dragon. Not only have to worry about damage from his flames, but also getting knocked off a block and falling to your death. Still, he's not really that difficult. Mega Man 2 is a bit longer than the first game. The number of robot masters has been bumped up to 8, which would then become the standard for the series. Wily's castle is now 6 levels, each ending with a boss fight, as well as there being a boss rush in which you rebattle each robot master. This guy is a tricky memorization-based boss. You have to know where the next block is going to be coming from. If you're standing on a block and it activates, you'll get hit and lose a bit of energy. Mega Man 2 is often described in the game's press as a labor of love. The original Mega Man team was given permission by Capcom to produce a sequel to Mega Man in the space between the time they were working on other assigned games, like Legendary Wings. Now, it turned out to be an excellent decision since Mega Man 2 was a huge hit, selling 1.5 million copies and becoming an instant classic. It received excellent reviews, and nowadays if you were to compile a list of the top 10 best NES games, you would almost certainly be required to put Mega Man 2 somewhere on that list. Unless you substitute Mega Man 3 instead, I suppose. However, the influential Japanese gaming mag Famitsu seemed oblivious to its charms, and scored an amazing 28 out of 40. Of course, they also gave Mega Man 3 a 23 out of 40 score, so who knows what exactly they were smoking back then. Mega Man 2's gameplay revolves around memorization, quick reflexes, and even a bit of quasi-puzzle solving. This boss requires you to use crash bombs to destroy each of the laser ports, some of which are protected by walls that also need a crash bomb to be destroyed. But you won't have enough bombs to blow up each wall and each port, so you have to use your flying platforms and find the path of getting over walls and using the least number of bombs. Now at the same time, each laser port is shooting at you, so you have to decide on your course of action quickly before you die. It's actually quite a bit trickier than it looks. As we approach the game's end, you'll find yourself in a transporter room that sends you to fight each robot master a second time. Thankfully, you have all the special weapons by now, though I guess so do the robot masters. I'm not even sure if these are the same robot masters or just second copies that Dr. Wily made. And of course, in Mega Man 2, there's nothing nearly as hard as the Yellow Devil, so it's really not that tricky to get through the end of the game. Another big factor in making the last few levels more easy are the fact that you now have those energy tanks and you can refill your health when you're getting low. Finally, you will encounter Dr. Wily himself in his crazy flying warship. He's one of those 2-stage bosses. First you have to destroy the blast shield, and then you just hammer away at the front end of it using the metal blades. But as the ship explodes, naturally, Dr. Wily escapes, him being the tenacious bastard that he is. And this leads you to a new 6th level, Underground. You get this Ghost and Goblin style progress chart between levels. The last level is super short and has no real enemies, but it does have a pretty cool start in which you materialize in midair and then freefall several screens to the bottom of the cavern. All these crazy slime things will drip gunk on you if you're not careful. And then at last you reach Wily himself, and in a shocking twist, he starts flying and transforms into his alien form. The final boss is a relatively simple pattern-based fight. If you get into the rhythm, it's not that difficult, but if you make a misstep and lose the rhythm, it can get icky real quick. Once you defeat him, you will get an unexpected and funny ending that I would rank as one of the best NES game endings ever. So, what's our opinion on Mega Man 2? It exceeds the original in just about every way. It is, as video game critics like to say, more refined. There are more bosses, better weapons, more variety in the level design, more surprises. Capcom stripped out some of the extreme difficulty of the first Mega Man game and made it a bit more fair and enjoyable. It's longer, but a password system has been added so you don't have to play it in one sitting. On the negative side, it was so successful that it set the pattern for all the later Mega Man games, and they sort of got kind of dull and repetitive after a while. But still, you can't really blame Mega Man 2 for the faults of Mega Man 5 or 6. Anyway, Mega Man 2 is probably the best console game Capcom has released so far, and because it was a massive hit, it cemented Capcom's reputation as one of the premier game publishers. And it made people stop associating Capcom with stuff like the early Micronic stealth releases. So it was a major milestone for Capcom. The last Japanese game of 1988 is from SNK, Guevara, though the name Guerrilla War also shows very briefly. And Guevara is, as odd as it seems, a game about Fidel Castro and Che Guevara. But when it came time to release it in the US, all explicit references to revolutionary Cuba were dropped, though we still get the rather obvious depiction of Castro in the intro. So Guerrilla War is yet another game in SNK's series of vertical run-and-guns, along with the Akira games and Heavy Barrel. SNK just loves the idea of some guy stomping through the jungle blowing stuff up. You're armed with a machine gun and grenades, which are thankfully unlimited. It actually works very much like Akira Warriors, with a little twist. You also need to rescue POWs, which are tied up to stakes like they were witches about to get burned. Accidentally killing them causes you to lose points. The original version was SNK's arcade game from 1987. It looked an awful lot like Akira, but with bigger, beefier sprites. You didn't have the same rotary controller scheme, and once again, two-player co-op was probably the way to go. Incidentally, when you die in the Japanese version, the game clearly shows the names of the characters as being Guevara and Castro, in case you had any doubt. Beyond the names and the text, however, the US and Japanese versions are pretty much identical. As expected, the home version deals with the loss of rotary controls by having you shoot in the direction you face. This can be a bit awkward at times. Now, something else borrowed from Akira, tanks. You occasionally find empty tanks you can jump into and go on a little rampage. Funnily enough, running over a POW while in your tank somehow rescues them, rather than simply squishing them. You get a variety of special weapons, both on foot and in the tank, such as a Contra-style spread shot. Enemy behavior is a bit different than Akira. Your opponents tend to come out of nowhere, shoot a few rounds at you, then retreat. They also like to hide in trenches. They will often come out of nowhere and surprise you. All in all, Guerrilla Warfare is better looking than Akira and has more variety. Still, I feel it's a bit lacking in comparison to similar games like Jackal. Take this for example. Apparently, this is the boss fight. That dude in the middle there is supposed to be a general, and for some reason he is just standing there in plain sight while you shoot at him with your tank. That's a pretty stupid thing for a general to do. It just doesn't make any sense. After you've killed him, a helicopter appears, which functions as a more conventional boss, but still it feels sort of unimpressive compared to the stuff we've been seeing in contemporary action games from Konami and Capcom. And the technical issues probably don't really help. There's a lot of flicker going on here. This definitely has a negative impact on certain things, such as the flamethrower weapon, which looks like a big old pile of dog doo. So Guerrilla War is definitely a big step up from stuff like Athena and the two Akira games. It shows SNK was headed in the right direction, but is not quite there yet. Ah, there, all done at last. Next time, it's 1989. Naturally, the pace picks up a bit. In fact, episode 41 will cover pretty much the entire month of January 1989, including some US releases. On the plus side, we have a pretty cool game from Vindicators. So, see you then.